Hey guys, Spudknocker here. Today we're going to kick off a new series on the F-14 Tomcat with a HOTAS setup video for the RIO Seat. I know this video has been highly requested in the comments section of my previous HOTAS setup for the pilot seat. This series of videos will be aimed at flying and learning about the DCS F-14 Tomcat with real-life F-14 aircrew. We will be joined most often by John, or Nozzle as he's known on Discord, who flew as a RIO for VF-11 Red Rippers, VF-201 and VF-202 from the early to mid 1980s through the early 1990s. We will just be referring to him as John, of course, to protect his privacy. He was a major advisor and subject matter expert for Heatblur for their simulation of the RIO Seat. John has told me that he really enjoys DCS and its community of fans and virtual pilots and all of the combined knowledge of the whole community together. And he is super glad that the flight simulator genre is back on the rise with titles like DCS, all the DCS modules, the IL-2 series, and others. We also hope to, in the future, get together with a few F-14 pilots to fly the DCS F-14 with us as well. This video will go over the HOTAS key bindings you should have set up in your backseat to most effectively direct your pilots and air intercepts, straight from a guy who did it in the real-life jet and the rationale he has behind his setup. So a huge thanks to John, and of course to Straywolf for putting this together, and stay tuned for more from John and other F-14 crew members. Alrighty, John, we're going to go ahead and fly on out to the range here, and I'll put her into an easy port side turn just underneath the cloud deck, and you guys can take it away.
Okay, sounds good, Spudknocker. I just wanted to start off by saying welcome to this video. It's my hope that we can at least give folks a chance to... where do you start with mapping the all of the options that you've got in the RIO controls menu for this incredible simulator? So I thought what I would do is give you a little bit of my rationale. I set it up the way it was easiest for me simply because I've got a lot of muscle memory in this cockpit, and so a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be putting on the stick are things that I manipulated with my right hand, and things that I'm going to be putting on my throttle unit are the things that I would have used my left hand to manipulate inside the cockpit. If you look down, right directly in front of us, you've got, of course, the TID, a hand control unit, which is probably something new to the vast majority of folks out there in DCS world. We'll talk about how I map the controls for this, and for the hand control unit. Also going to be talking about these selection tiles just to the left of the HCU itself. Also looking up forward at the tiles for the display on the TID, and go a little bit into the DDD panel itself. And then that'll be essentially the focus of what I have mapped to my stick, either with buttons or with trim wheels and things like that. On the left side of the cockpit, I'm going to be focusing the mapping of the throttle itself. See if I can zoom in a little bit here. I have to apologize a little bit for the jerkiness. I'm trying not to use my track IR to make things easier for you to watch. And for the HOTAS, I'm going to be focusing on these controls here: the antenna elevation course adjustment knob, the antenna elevation bar adjustment, the azimuth scan volume, the azimuth centering, and then last but not least, the VSL high and VSL low. All of those are going to be mapped on the throttle. And the reason I did it that way again was because my left hand was in this area almost exclusively while I was running an intercept or using the AUG-9 system to prosecute getting into a fight with some bogies. So we're going to talk a little bit also in addition with the AUG-15 panel here, where you see there's like this air-to-air section which has been segmented off. There's a couple of knobs here that I think I'm going to try just starting out with this simulator. One is a next launch button, and the other one is selecting Phoenix active. Those, again, I used by feel as I was concentrating on the TID itself, and that's why I, pardon me, that's why I have also bound those to selections on the throttle. So we'll back out a little bit here and talk quickly about what's available. I'm going to bring up the control adjustment, select RIO, and there's really two areas where you can probably focus almost all of your efforts. The first one is HCU. Where is the HCU? Hand control unit. What you see here is just the way I've mapped this one. As you can see, these are all right up here with my joystick. Here's the first ones you want to think about. The first one is half action and full action. We don't really have, at least not on my stick, I don't have the ability to go half action or have a two-stage trigger. So what I've done is I've just mapped one of my left thumb button to the half action, and I'll show you why that's important here in a second. And then I've done full action on the trigger itself. And here's what that kind of looks like as you manipulate. So I'm hitting the thumb button, and that, wait a minute, what I forgot to do was go back and hit Ddd Cursor. Again, I use these just by feel, going back and forth as I change the focus. For those of you that have flown the F-18, this is a lot like your sensor control, where you can go to either the DDIs, the HUD, or the MPCD displays. This is the same idea. Where are you going to focus the interaction of the HCU with your displays? So here, Ddd Cursor, I'm going to go half action, and that brings up the little hook cursor. If I went full action, you'll see it go bright, and that go full action again to deselect. So for instance, you can select home base that way, deselect it, or you can select a waypoint or any kind of target. That's the general idea with using half action and full action. If you go to Ddd Cursor, let's go back up to the DDD, and you'll see how that changes. Going half detent, you'll see I'm in pulse search now, and that's because basically that's the only mode you can really get any mileage out of this cursor itself. The half action gives you the crosshairs. Full action allows you to try and hook a target like I just did. Hit half action again, and that releases your cursor, and you're back where you started from. If you go to the next radar mode, again, I have this mapped to a button on my at the base of my stick rather. Then go back up. We're in pulse search now. Here's which go half action again, and that gives you your range captain's bars, just like you'd have on an F-18 or an F-15, and then going full action attempts to lock up whatever you had. I didn't have anything there, so it was an unsuccessful lock, but I think you get the idea. Half action, full action. Last but not least is the TV itself. This will give you the ability, when you select TV, you'll see half action, moving the cursor down, moving the cursor back up, and then trying to lock on a contrast lock, full action, and It was an unsuccessful lock simply because there really wasn't enough contrast. But I think you get the idea. So that's these buttons, which again I have mapped going back to the controls menu. Here was that. Here's a little trick though. HCU DDD mode. That is actually the cross, the iron cross I got when I selected Ddd Cursor. That was for ground mapping. This button here is for MRL. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I also mapped that to one of my buttons for my thumb on this particular joystick I have. Radar mode. You saw how that worked. TCS mode, and then TID mode. Again, these are buttons that I would use and controlled without having to look down at my hand. I just memorized by feel where those buttons were. Another thing I did on the HCU was the thumb wheel. This is a fine adjustment on the azimuth. I'm sorry, not azimuth. The elevation of the radar antenna. So I have all three of these HCU thumb wheels mapped to the trim switch, actually, on the stick. So I trim up, and that gives me the I trim up, and that gives me the thumb wheel up, trim down, and that gives me the thumb wheel down. That'll give you plus and minus 4 degrees of control, fine adjustment over the radar. But unlike the radar elevation control on the F-14 stick, which is spring-loaded to the center position, the thumb wheel on the HCU here in the F-14 is not spring-loaded. So what you've got to do is you've got to map a thumb wheel recenter to give you to get you back to the center. On the actual hand control thumb wheel, there was a notch that I could feel that would tell me when I was recentered. Also in the display on the TID, you'll also be able to see what's happening with your thumb wheel. Let's take a look. As I use my elevation, I'm doing a trim wheel down, and you can see I'm getting a fine adjustment all the way down to a negative 4 degrees. If I trim all the way back up, positive 4 degrees, and then I click left trim, and right trim, and that gets me back to 0. The last one I talked about was MRL, which is a little button you can't really see. Hold on a second. If I move the stick over, the MRL push button was right here, and that was a manual rapid lock-on mode. The most utility I ever got out of that was trying to find the tanker. What that does is it's kind of an interesting mode. I didn't get a lot of utility out of it, but what happens when you hit MRL is you get this sort of, you'll see that as I mash the MRL button, I'm actually physically controlling the pulse sweep. As I move my hand controller to the right, the pulse, it automatically commands the antenna, and this is actually an elevation. Look over to the left at my elevation strobe. When I say to the left, I mean this little actual indicator of where my antenna is pointing. Watch what happens as I continue to move. As I move it down, I'm not moving in range, I'm moving in antenna elevation. And so this again is a pulse. You'll see up at the range, it's always out to 5 miles. So the screen is showing you 5 miles elevation, 5 miles of range, and then the cursor is moving in elevation. Again, it was kind of hard to use tactically, at least it was for me. But when you're trying to find a tanker and the visibility conditions are not real great, then you can kind of fish for it using MRL like we were just looking at. And that's essentially the main buttons I used on the hand control unit. There were a couple of exceptions. I think that what I also mapped to my was the next launch indicator and the Phoenix active. Again, something that I could work by feel, and I had extra buttons on the stick, so that's where I put them. Not sure how they're going to work in practice, but we'll take a look. And that brings us to what I use for the throttle. And bring us back over here. This is a panel that was used almost constantly to manipulate the radar. And the reason was that in TrackWell Scan Manual, you can adjust these to give you the kind of scan volume you want and not have to rely on TrackWell Scan Auto to make those decisions for you. Also, you'll see with the Azimuth control, you can sweep the antenna right and left. So if you're in a turn, say you're in a port turn, you can sweep it to the left, and that'll give your radar the most time to pick up any targets that start coming to the nose from your port side. This antenna elevation is a very coarse adjustment knob. I've also mapped this. The way I've mapped these is basically using hat switches. I've got one hat switch which controls my azimuth and scan volumes, and I've got one hat switch that controls my antenna elevation in coarse adjustment and also in elevation bars. So for instance, the way I've mapped mine is whenever I push a hat switch forward on my throttle, I increase a value. So in this case, if I go left and right on my azimuth, it just sweeps my azimuth left and right. If I go click it forward, I get more scan volume. If I click aft, I get less scan volume. Same idea for the antenna as well. If I scan up, it raises the antenna. If I use my hat switch down, same idea. Elevation goes down. Then elevation bars. If I go press it forward, I get more bars. If I go aft, I get less bars. As you probably already know by now, TrackWell Scan will give you has only a couple of choices for you. You can go 20 degree 4 bar or 2 bar 40 degree. And that's a function of basically how often the TrackWell Scan antenna needs to get a contact for it to maintain a track file. When you're in a search mode though, you can open it up much greater so that you can go to 65 degrees on your azimuth scan if you want to, or you can bring it all the way down to 10. Same idea with elevation bars. You can go anywhere from 1 to 8 if you're in one of your search modes. Again, those would be PD search or pulse search. Anything else, range while search or track while scan, you're going to be limited, as we said. So how does that look practically speaking when we start looking at the actual TID? Try to see if I can get you a chance to see both of them at the same time. So again, taking a look at the TID, if we were in a port hand turn like we are now, you can tell by the artificial horizon, I would try and scan all the way to the left so that as, like you can see that waypoint 3, if that's where the bogey call happened to be and that's where I thought my target was going to end up, I'd want to keep my scan volume there, and as he started to drift to the right, I keep him in my scan volume, giving my TrackWell Scan the maximum amount of time to try and start creating a track file. If I was in pulse search, again, this is really handy because what's really frustrating is trying to find a bogey on your DDD panel and getting a whole bunch of it's interesting. You see the radar scan is going nuts. And the reason I say that is I've got a ton of bars scheduled right now. And the problem with that is you'll start to see targets appear and then disappear as your scan volumes, as your bars keep going up and down and up and down. So that's why I would select the minimum amount of scan bars when I was in a pulse search mode. And then I would use my thumb wheel, as we talked about before, to do that fine adjustment to try and really break out that that target, whether it's a single target or whether maybe trying to break out a multiple targets that are flying welded wings, something like that. You'll see the difference between using my thumb wheel, very gradual. That's why I refer to it as a fine adjustment. If you look at, and I'm going to use the coarse adjustment, which is on the left console, and you can see how it much more rapidly changes your elevation, which makes it really hard to control unless you need rapid sweeps like I'm doing now. You can see how the DDD is changing here as well. Opening up my scan volume, and you can see that's the ground return I'm seeing now. So come back up on antenna elevation, and we're back where we started from. So that's essentially how it worked, at least for me when I was running the radar. Track while scan manual, remember, you're only going to have a couple of options available to you in terms of scan volumes. You can select different scan volumes, but you're not necessarily going to get them. For instance, I'm trying to get more bars, but I'm not going to get them. I'm only going to get 4 bars or 2 bars. Even though you can physically change it, the computer's not going to allow you to get it. Also, same thing applies to the scan volume. I've got 65 selected here, but you'll see up at the TID, it's not actually 65. But if I went to pulse search, now it opens it all the way up to the scan volume that I've selected. So let's go back, take a look at real quick how I did the TID controls. I'm sorry, I think they call it no wonder. Man, I get caught by that every time. Okay, going back to the radar control panel. You'll see here all those switches we just talked about. The azimuth left and azimuth right. Two different buttons to that trim hat that I talked about. Scan narrow, widen it up. Again, all of these azimuth are on the same hat. All of these elevation control are also on the same hat. Up and down, as we talked about, and then increase bars and decrease bars. The last thing I want to talk about is VSL high and low. And I use that every time we were engaged. I was constantly using VSL. And you'll see it here. It's VSL low and VSL high. It was hard to use in the cockpit. That's why they typically tried to put on these little extenders. It actually looks exactly like the stab out and stab in switch. They put a little extender on here. Get that out of the way so you can see it. And I've also mapped this actually to the antenna control on my throttle. So as I can select high by toggling up and select low. The way that I would use that tactically, let me zoom out a little bit here so you get a better sense. When you would look up into this area right about in through here, this would be your VSL high scan volume. So when I would hit VSL high, you'll see the radar here is going into that scan volume in a practical sense. You can also see that we've gone to a B scan here, which the radar is trying to lock up. And the way and so if you see a bogey that is in this area right in through here, that's where VSL high is going to be locking them up. If you go VSL low, which I'm selecting now, you'll see it's essentially centered around the nose of the aircraft. And practically speaking, if the bogey was anywhere from right about here, right above the ejection seat for the pilot, extending to about where your feet would be if you extended the radar scan volume down in that direction. And again, this gives you a sense of where the radar is trying to lock up. VSL is a pulse radar mode, and so in order to get out of that, you just select any other mode, and you'll go back to whatever mode you have selected. And that essentially covers all of the bindings I have for the back seat. I didn't really cover the Lantern hand controller for the simple reason that Lantern is probably going to require a separate mapping on the throttle all to itself that have to try and figure out a way to alternate between two different throttle control setups. One for running air intercepts, where I'm focusing on AUG9 operation, and then using a separate mapping stratum when I'm got a lantern pod attached and I've got the lantern stick in the back seat. And I think that pretty much covers it. Spud, did I miss anything?
Nope, I think that's it. Thanks a lot, John, for showing off your key bindings and your rationale behind them to my viewers, and now your viewers as well. So hopefully in some future videos we'll get a little bit more exciting, talk about communication from the RIO cockpit to the pilot, and vice versa during an air intercept, or even during a air-to-ground bombing run or something of that nature. And hopefully we can blow some stuff up and get into some more exciting things. But we always have to build from the very first building blocks and make sure we have a solid foundation from which to build our F-14 Tomcat skills. So thanks a lot, John, and thanks a lot to you guys out there watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and a subscribe. That always helps. So thanks a lot, guys, and have fun. Hey guys, so there is one really important keybind that we did miss in the full video, and that is the thumb hat switches on the towel rack for countermeasures dispense programs and options for chaff, flares, etc. And this is super important. I actually have it mapped to my stick, whereas John has it mapped to his throttle. Either way is totally valid and still falls within the scheme that John has laid out for the idea of left-hand stuff on the throttle, right-hand stuff on the stick. And these are dual controls, so both thumb buttons does the exact same thing. You only need to have one mapped, so just make sure you have at least one mapped, whether it's on your throttle or on your stick, because that's very important for the survivability of your F-14 in a combat environment. Whether it's air-to-air or air-to-ground, we always need to be releasing countermeasures whenever we're engaged. So, there it is. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you guys fly safe and have fun as always. Happy hunting, guys.